The morning sun filtered through my kitchen window just like it had every day for the past 15 years, casting familiar shadows across the worn wooden table where I sat with my coffee and the newspaper. At 78, I had grown to appreciate the predictable rhythm of my days. Wake at 6, coffee by 6:30, news until 7:15, then a walk around the neighborhood before the world got too busy. It was a routine that served me well, kept me sharp. The morning sun filtered through my kitchen window just like it had every day for the past 15 years, casting familiar shadows across the worn wooden table where I sat with my coffee and the newspaper. At 78, I had grown to appreciate the predictable rhythm of my days. Wake at 6, coffee by 6:30, news until 7:15, then a walk around the neighborhood before the world got too busy. It was a routine that served me well, kept me sharp, kept me connected to the world even as that world seemed to change faster than I could sometimes follow. That Tuesday morning started no differently than any other, except for the sound of a car door slamming in my driveway earlier than usual. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 7:10. Too early for visitors, too late for deliveries. Through the window, I watched my grandson Marcus stride up the walkway with that purposeful gait he had inherited from his father, my son David. Marcus was 26 now, fresh out of business school with ideas about everything and experience with very little. Still, he was family, and I had always been proud of his ambition, even when it sometimes rubbed against my more traditional ways of doing things. He knocked twice before using the key I had given him years ago, something I was beginning to wonder about lately. Marcus had been coming by more frequently in recent months, always with some concern about my welfare, always with suggestions about how I could make my life easier, more modern, more efficient. The boy meant well, I told myself, but there was something about his recent visits that left me feeling less like a grandfather being visited and more like a problem being managed. "Good morning, Grandpa," Marcus said as he entered the kitchen, his voice carrying that bright, professional tone he used when he was about to present an idea. "I brought those forms we talked about last week. You remember, the ones that will help simplify your banking situation." I remembered no such conversation about forms, but I nodded anyway, gesturing for him to sit down. Marcus had been talking a lot lately about my banking situation, as he called it. To me, it seemed perfectly straightforward. I had my checking account for daily expenses, my savings account for emergencies, and my investment accounts that I had been managing just fine for decades. But Marcus saw complexity where I saw simplicity, problems where I saw solutions that had worked for years. "The thing is, Grandpa," he continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase, "managing multiple accounts can be really challenging, especially with all the new security measures and online requirements. I know you prefer doing things in person at the bank, but that is not always practical anymore. What if we consolidated everything into one account that I could help you monitor? Just to make sure everything stays organized and secure." I sipped my coffee and studied his face. Marcus had his mother's green eyes and his father's determined jaw, but something else flickered behind his expression that I could not quite identify. It was not malice, exactly, but it was not pure concern either. There was an eagerness there, a kind of anticipation that made me uncomfortable in a way I could not yet articulate. Where in the world are you listening to this story, I wonder, and what time is it where you are right now? Whether you are starting your day like I was that morning, or winding down from a long day, you probably understand the feeling of someone in your family suddenly taking an interest in your affairs. It is flattering at first, this attention, this apparent concern for your well-being. But sometimes, if you have lived as long as I have, you learn to pay attention to the feelings that stir beneath the surface of these well-meaning conversations. Marcus spread the papers across my kitchen table, pointing to various sections highlighted in yellow. "These are just signature pages," he explained. "Nothing complicated. This one gives me limited power of attorney for banking purposes only, just so I can help you if there is ever an emergency. This one consolidates your accounts into a single checking account with online access. And this one sets up automatic bill pay so you never have to worry about missing payments. I picked up one of the forms, squinting at the small print. The language was dense, full of legal terms that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Limited power of attorney sounded reasonable enough, but the details were buried in paragraphs of text that would have challenged a lawyer. I set the paper down and looked at Marcus, who was watching me with that same eager expression. "Son," I said, using the nickname I had called him since he was small, "I appreciate your concern, but I have been managing my own finances for 60 years. I think I can handle a few more." Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on a patient tone that reminded me uncomfortably of how people spoke to children or invalids. "I know you can, Grandpa. You have always been incredibly capable. But things are different now. Banking is mostly online, security is more complex, and honestly, at your age, it is just smart to have a backup plan. What if something happened to you? What if you forgot a password or could not get to the bank? I am just trying to help you prepare for those possibilities." The phrase "at your age" hit me like a small slap. I was 78, not ancient, and my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I still balanced my checkbook to the penny, still remembered every investment I had made, still knew exactly how much money I had and where it was. But Marcus was speaking to me as if I were already sliding into incompetence, as if age alone had rendered me incapable of basic decision-making. "I need some time to think about this," I told him, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "These are important decisions, and I do not like to rush into anything involving my finances." Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something that might have been frustration or impatience. "Of course," he said, recovering quickly. "Take all the time you need. But maybe we should not wait too long. These new banking regulations are changing all the time, and it is better to get ahead of them than to be caught unprepared." After he left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the papers he had left behind. The coffee had grown cold, and the newspaper lay unread beside me. Something about the conversation had unsettled me in a way I could not shake. It was not just the papers or the suggestions about my competence. It was the assumption behind it all, the presumption that I needed managing, that my independence was somehow a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected. I had not lived through the Depression, built a career, raised a family, and accumulated a lifetime of experience just to hand over control of my affairs to someone who thought my age automatically made me vulnerable. But Marcus was family, and family was supposed to have your best interests at heart. The question that would haunt me in the days to come was simple: whose best interests was Marcus really serving? The papers Marcus had left behind sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days like an unwelcome reminder of our conversation. Every time I walked past them, I felt that same unsettled feeling that had plagued me since his visit. On Friday morning, I finally decided to take them to my longtime attorney, Harold Brennan, who had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years. Harold was one of the few people left who remembered me as a younger man, who had known me when I was building my career and making the financial decisions that had secured my comfortable retirement. Harold's office was in an old brownstone downtown, the kind of place that made you feel like serious business was conducted there. He read through Marcus's papers with the careful attention of someone who had seen every kind of family financial arrangement imaginable. After 10 minutes of silence broken only by the sound of pages turning, he looked up at me over his reading glasses. "Frank," he said, using the serious tone he reserved for important matters, "these documents would give your grandson significant control over your financial life. The power of attorney language is broader than he described to you. It would allow him to make investment decisions, move money between accounts, even close accounts if he deemed it necessary." I felt a chill run down my spine. That was not how Marcus had explained it at all. He had made it sound like a simple convenience, a way to help me navigate modern banking. But Harold's interpretation painted a very different picture, one where I could find myself financially dependent on someone who was already treating me like an incompetent old man. "What would you recommend?" I asked Harold, though I was already forming my own opinion about those papers. Harold leaned back in his chair, studying me with the frank assessment of an old friend. "You have always been careful with your money, Frank. You have never made impulsive decisions, and you have certainly never needed anyone to manage your affairs for you. If you are feeling pressured into this arrangement, I would suggest you trust that instinct." That afternoon, I called Marcus and told him I had decided not to sign the papers. His response was immediate and revealing. He did not ask why or express understanding for my decision. Instead, he launched into a lengthy explanation of all the ways I was making things harder for myself, all the potential problems I was creating by refusing to modernize my approach to banking. "Grandpa," he said, and I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice, "I am just trying to help you avoid problems down the road. What if you forget your passwords? What if you lose your wallet? What if something happens and you cannot get to the bank? These are real concerns that we need to address." "I have been thinking about those same concerns for years," I told him, "and I have my own plans for handling them. But I appreciate your worry." The conversation ended awkwardly, with Marcus promising to check on me again soon. But something had shifted between us, something that made me realize our relationship was changing in ways I had not anticipated. Marcus was no longer just my grandson offering to help. He was someone who had a specific agenda for my life, someone who was not particularly interested in my own preferences about how that life should be lived. I wonder how many of you listening right now have experienced something similar with your own families, that moment when you realize that someone you love and trust has started seeing you as a project to be managed rather than a person to be respected. It is a painful realization, one that forces you to question not just their motives, but your own judgment about the people closest to you. Over the next few weeks, Marcus's visits became more frequent and more focused. He would arrive with printouts of articles about elderly financial fraud, stories about senior citizens who had been taken advantage of by scammers, statistics about the dangers of handling money without proper safeguards. He never said directly that I was vulnerable to these same problems, but the implication was clear. He was building a case for why I needed his protection, why my independence was actually a liability. The most troubling part was how reasonable it all sounded. Marcus was articulate and well-informed, and he presented his argument with the polish of someone who had learned to be persuasive. He talked about identity theft and online security, about the complexity of modern financial systems and the challenges facing people of my generation. He made it sound like the world had become too dangerous and complicated for someone like me to navigate alone. But I had not survived almost 8 decades by being naive about the world or the people in it. I had learned to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate me, even when that someone was family, even when their arguments contained elements of truth. Marcus was using real concerns about elderly financial security to justify taking control of my money, and he was doing it with a determination that suggested his motives were not as pure as he claimed. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus arrived with a different set of papers. These were not requests for power of attorney or account consolidation. These were applications for new credit cards, cards that would be linked to my accounts but would have Marcus listed as an authorized user. Just as a precaution, he explained. This way, if your cards are ever lost or stolen, or if you forget them when you go out, I can help you with any purchases you need to make. It is just another layer of security. I stared at the applications, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Marcus was systematically working to gain access to every aspect of my financial life, and he was doing it with the patience and persistence of someone who had thought this through very carefully. This was not the impulsive concern of a worried grandson. This was a campaign. I refused to sign the credit card applications, but Marcus did not give up. Instead, he changed his approach, becoming more subtle in his manipulation while simultaneously more aggressive in his goals. He started showing up at my house with groceries, insisting on paying for them himself and suggesting that I should not be carrying cash or using my cards for such routine purchases. He began offering to drive me to appointments, claiming concern about my safety behind the wheel, though I had been driving without incident for over 60 years. The pattern became clear after a few weeks. Marcus was systematically inserting himself into every aspect of my daily life that involved money or independence. He would arrive just as I was preparing to leave for the bank, offering to handle whatever business I had planned. He would call during my usual shopping hours, suggesting that he pick up whatever I needed. He was creating a situation where I would become dependent on him for basic activities, where his involvement would seem necessary rather than intrusive. What made it particularly insidious was how he framed every intervention as concern for my well-being. When I mentioned that I preferred to handle my own banking, he would respond with stories about elderly people who had been confused by new procedures or overwhelmed by long lines. When I insisted on driving myself to appointments, he would cite statistics about accident rates among senior citizens. He never directly said that I was incompetent, but he surrounded every conversation with implications that my independence was dangerous. The real escalation began when Marcus started staying overnight at my house. He claimed it was temporary, just until his apartment lease was renewed, but he quickly established routines that suggested a more permanent arrangement. He took over my spare bedroom, moved in enough belongings to make it clear he was not just visiting, and began treating my home as if it were partly his. More concerning, he started intercepting my mail, claiming he was just trying to help me stay organized and ensure that important documents did not get overlooked. One morning, I discovered that Marcus had been through my desk drawers, organizing my financial papers into neat folders labeled with his precise handwriting. When I confronted him about it, he seemed genuinely surprised by my objection. He claimed he had been trying to help me create a better filing system, something that would make it easier for me to find important documents when I needed them. But I knew what my own filing system looked like, and it had worked perfectly well for decades. What Marcus had done was not organization, it was reconnaissance. He had gone through every piece of financial documentation in my house, photographed or copied bank statements, investment reports, insurance policies, and tax returns. He now had a complete picture of my financial situation, information that I had never volunteered to share with him. The violation felt profound, not just because of the invasion of privacy, but because of the calculated nature of it. Marcus had used his position as my grandson, his access to my home, and my trust in him to gather intelligence about my assets. The breaking point came when I discovered that Marcus had contacted my bank directly, claiming to be concerned about my mental competency and asking about procedures for protecting elderly customers from financial mistakes. The branch manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, had worked with me for 15 years and knew me well enough to be skeptical of such claims. She called me personally to discuss the conversation, and her description of Marcus's inquiries left me both furious and frightened. Mrs. Rodriguez told me that Marcus had asked about power of attorney procedures, about what documentation would be needed to take over someone's accounts, and about the bank's policies regarding customers who might be experiencing cognitive decline. He had not made any direct accusations about my mental state, but he had planted seeds of doubt about my competency while positioning himself as the concerned family member who was trying to protect me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marcus was not just trying to gain control of my finances through manipulation and pressure. He was actively working to undermine my reputation and credibility, creating a narrative that would justify taking over my affairs whether I consented or not. He was building a case that I was no longer capable of managing my own life, and he was doing it behind my back, using my own bank and potentially other institutions where I conducted business. That evening, I sat in my living room watching Marcus move around my house with the casual familiarity of someone who had already decided it was partly his. He made dinner using groceries he had purchased, answered my phone when it rang, and sorted through my mail as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He had transformed himself from a visitor into a caretaker, and he had done it so gradually that I had not realized how much ground I had lost until it was almost too late. I began to understand that Marcus's campaign was more sophisticated than I had initially realized. He was not just trying to convince me to give him control of my finances. He was creating conditions where that control would become inevitable, where my resistance would seem unreasonable, where outside observers would see him as the responsible party looking out for an elderly relative who was no longer capable of self-care. The most chilling aspect was how plausible his narrative could sound to someone who did not know me well. An elderly man living alone, resistant to modern banking procedures, suspicious of family members who were trying to help him navigate an increasingly complex financial world. It was a story that would resonate with social workers, bank officials, and even judges who saw similar cases regularly. Marcus was not just stealing my money, he was stealing my credibility, my reputation, and my right to make decisions about my own life. The truth revealed itself on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I returned from what was supposed to be a brief walk around the neighborhood. I had forgotten my umbrella and decided to turn back after only 2 blocks, arriving home much earlier than Marcus expected. As I approached my front door, I could hear his voice through the window, animated and confident in a way that made me pause before entering. He was on the phone, and something about his tone made me stop and listen. I stood on my own front porch, rain dripping from my jacket, eavesdropping on a conversation that would shatter whatever remaining trust one had in my grandson. Marcus was talking to someone about numbers, about timelines, about strategies for what he called the final phase. At first, I thought he might be discussing work, but as I listened more carefully, I realized he was talking about me. "The old man is being more stubborn than we expected," Marcus said, his voice carrying none of the respectful concern he showed when speaking to me directly. "But I have been documenting everything. The bank manager is already questioning his competency, and I have been keeping detailed records of his confusion and resistance to reasonable help. We should be able to move forward within the next few weeks." My hands began to shake, whether from the cold rain or the shock of what I was hearing, I could not tell. Marcus continued talking, outlining a plan that was far more comprehensive and calculated than anything I had imagined. He talked about medical evaluations that could be arranged, about legal procedures for declaring someone incompetent, about the timeline for gaining full control of my assets once the proper documentation was in place. The person on the other end of the call must have asked about my financial situation, because Marcus launched into a detailed description of my accounts, my investments, and my property holdings. He spoke about my money with the casual familiarity of someone who had studied every aspect of my financial life, someone who had already begun thinking of those assets as his own. What chilled me most was the accuracy of his information. He knew details about my finances that I had never shared with anyone, information he could have gathered only by systematically going through my private papers. "I have been living here for 6 weeks now," Marcus continued, "and he has become completely dependent on me for basic activities. He barely leaves the house without me anymore, and when he does, he seems confused and overwhelmed. I have been documenting all of this, building a clear case that he needs full-time supervision and financial management." The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Marcus had not just been trying to gain control of my money. He had been systematically creating conditions that would justify that control, manufacturing evidence of my incompetency while simultaneously making me more dependent on him. Every offer to help, every expression of concern, every suggestion that I was making things too difficult for myself had been part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine my independence and credibility. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which Marcus discussed legal strategies, talked about which family members would support his actions, and outlined his plans for managing my assets once he gained control. He spoke about selling my house, liquidating my investments, and moving me into what he called a more appropriate living situation. He talked about my life and my future as if I were already mentally incompetent, as if my preferences and wishes were irrelevant to decisions about my own existence. When Marcus finally ended the call, I remained on the porch for several more minutes, trying to process the enormity of what I had discovered. My grandson was not just planning to steal my money. He was planning to steal my entire life, to declare me incompetent and assume complete control over every aspect of my existence. And he was doing it with the patience and thoroughness of someone who had been planning this for months, possibly years. I quietly entered my house through the back door, moving carefully to avoid alerting Marcus to my presence. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to respond to a threat that was far more serious than I had realized. Marcus was not just a greedy family member trying to manipulate an elderly relative. He was executing a comprehensive plan to take over my life, and he was doing it with legal precision and psychological sophistication. That evening, Marcus behaved exactly as he had for weeks, expressing concern about my wet clothes, insisting on making dinner, asking about my day with apparent genuine interest. But now I could see through the performance. Every gesture of care was calculated, every expression of concern was designed to reinforce the narrative he was building about my helplessness and his indispensability. He was not just living in my house, he was studying me, documenting my behavior, gathering evidence that could be used against me in legal proceedings. The most disturbing aspect was how convincing his act remained even after I knew the truth. Marcus was skilled at playing the role of the devoted grandson, and I could understand how others might be fooled by his performance. Bank officials, social workers, judges, and even other family members would see what Marcus wanted them to see, a responsible young man trying to help an elderly relative who was becoming increasingly difficult and irrational. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to Marcus moving around in what used to be my spare bedroom, I realized that I was facing the most serious threat of my adult life. This was not just about money or control. This was about my fundamental right to exist as an autonomous human being, to make decisions about my own life, to maintain my dignity and independence in my final years. Marcus had underestimated me in one crucial way, however. He assumed that my age and his apparent advantages in education and legal knowledge meant that I was defenseless against his campaign. He thought that an elderly man living alone would be an easy target for manipulation and control. But Marcus did not know everything about his grandfather. He did not know about the preparations I had made for exactly this kind of situation, the resources I had accumulated over decades of careful planning and conservative investment. Most importantly, Marcus did not know about the gold. The final blow came 3 days after I discovered Marcus's true intentions. I had been careful not to let on that I knew about his scheme, maintaining the same routine while quietly trying to figure out my next move. But Marcus was apparently ready to accelerate his timeline, and on Friday morning, he delivered the news that would have devastated a man who was truly as helpless as Marcus believed me to be. "Grandpa," he said over breakfast, using that same concerned tone that I now recognized as completely artificial, "I have been thinking about our conversations regarding your banking situation. I know you have been resistant to making changes, but I am really worried about your financial security. Yesterday, I noticed some irregularities in your account activity that concern me." I set down my coffee cup carefully, knowing that whatever came next would be a lie designed to justify whatever action Marcus had already taken. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. Marcus pulled out a folder, the same precise organization he had been using to document what he claimed was my declining competency. There were several transactions that did not make sense, he explained. Small withdrawals at odd times, purchases that did not seem like things you would normally buy. I called the bank to ask about them, and Mrs. Rodriguez suggested that we might want to consider additional security measures to protect your accounts. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable while being fundamentally dishonest. There had been no irregular transactions because I kept meticulous records of every penny I spent. Mrs. Rodriguez had not suggested additional security measures because she knew me well enough to trust my financial judgment. Marcus was creating a fictional crisis to justify the action he was about to take. So I took the liberty of implementing some temporary safeguards, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. I have temporarily blocked your credit and debit cards, just until we can sort out these security issues. I know it seems drastic, but it is really the best way to protect you from any potential fraud or unauthorized use. The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had actually done it. He had used whatever access he had gained through his conversations with the bank to block my cards, effectively cutting off my access to my own money. I was supposed to be grateful for this protection, supposed to see it as evidence of his care and concern. Instead, I saw it for what it was, the final step in his campaign to make me completely dependent on him. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked how long this temporary measure would last. Marcus assured me that it would only be for a few days, just long enough to implement the new security procedures he had been recommending. Of course, those procedures included giving him authorized access to my accounts, the same arrangements I had already refused to sign. Now he was using manufactured crisis to force my compliance with demands I had previously rejected. The isolation was immediate and devastating. Without my cards, I could not buy groceries, could not pay for gas, could not handle any of the routine transactions that made independent living possible. Marcus had effectively trapped me in my own home, dependent on him for every purchase, every errand, every aspect of daily life that required money. And he had done it while maintaining the fiction that he was protecting me from financial threats that existed only in his imagination. That afternoon, Marcus went out to handle what he called essential errands, leaving me alone in my house for the first time in weeks. The silence felt oppressive, but it also gave me the opportunity one needed to assess my true situation. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where this nightmare had begun with those first documents Marcus had wanted me to sign, and tried to think clearly about my options. Whether it is dawn where you are listening to this or the middle of the night, I imagine some of you understand the feeling of being trapped by people who claim to have your best interests at heart. The isolation is not just physical, it is psychological. You begin to doubt your own perceptions, to wonder if perhaps the people manipulating you really do know better than you do about what is best for your life. The most insidious part of Marcus's strategy was how it could appear reasonable to outside observers. An elderly man whose grandson was concerned about his financial security, who had implemented protective measures after noticing suspicious account activity. To someone who did not know the truth, Marcus would seem like the responsible party in this situation. I would seem like the stubborn, possibly confused elderly person who was resisting help from a caring family member. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that blocking my cards would leave me completely helpless, that I had no other resources to draw upon, that I was as financially vulnerable as he wanted everyone to believe. He thought that cutting off my access to conventional banking would force me to accept his control, that I would have no choice but to sign whatever documents he presented as the price of regaining access to my own money. Marcus did not know about the preparations I had been making for decades, the alternative resources I had accumulated specifically for situations where conventional financial systems might be compromised. He did not know about the small fortune I had been quietly converting to physical assets, assets that existed completely outside the banking system he thought he had learned to manipulate. During the long afternoon alone in my house, I made my way to the basement, to a corner that looked like nothing more than a cluttered storage area filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. Behind a false panel I had installed years ago, secured with a lock that looked old and rusted but was actually quite sophisticated, lay my real insurance policy against exactly the kind of situation Marcus had created. 27 one-ounce gold bars, purchased over the course of 15 years and stored in a location that no bank records could reveal, no financial statements could document, no amount of research into my official assets could uncover. Each bar was worth more than $3,000 at current prices, representing a liquid asset base of over $80,000 that existed completely outside the financial system Marcus thought he controlled. Gold had been my hedge against uncertainty for most of my adult life. I had lived through enough economic upheavals, enough changes in financial systems, enough examples of institutions failing their customers to know that sometimes the old ways of storing wealth were the most reliable. While Marcus had been studying my bank statements and investment accounts, while he had been calculating the value of assets he thought he understood, the most significant portion of my real wealth had been sitting in my basement, invisible to his sophisticated analysis. As I held one of the gold bars in my hands, feeling its substantial weight and remembering the careful planning that had gone into acquiring it, I realized that Marcus's trap was not as complete as he believed. I was not as helpless as he assumed, and his control over my conventional finances was not the devastating blow he thought it would be. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Harold Brennan arrived at my door unannounced, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who had been thinking hard about something important. I had not called him since our conversation about Marcus's papers weeks earlier, but Harold had been practicing law long enough to recognize when family situations were deteriorating rapidly. "Frank," he said as I invited him into my living room, "I have been concerned about you since our last conversation. Yesterday, I received a call from someone claiming to represent your interests, asking about procedures for establishing guardianship over elderly clients. The caller identified himself as your grandson and suggested that you were experiencing cognitive difficulties that required legal intervention." The words hit me like cold water. Marcus was moving faster than I had anticipated, already reaching out to legal professionals to begin the process of having me declared incompetent. But Harold's next words gave me hope that Marcus's campaign might not be as foolproof as he believed. "The thing is," Harold continued, "I have known you for 20 years, and nothing about our recent interactions suggested any decline in your mental faculties. When someone calls me claiming that a longtime client is suddenly incompetent, especially when that client seemed perfectly sharp just a few weeks ago, I tend to be skeptical. So I thought I would stop by and see how you were doing for myself." I made coffee and told Harold everything. About Marcus's gradual infiltration of my life, about the papers he had wanted me to sign, about his systematic gathering of information about my finances, about the phone conversation I had overheard, and about the blocked credit cards that had left me financially isolated. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, his expression growing more serious as the scope of Marcus's manipulation became clear. When I finished my account, Harold was quiet for several minutes, studying his notes and considering the legal implications of what I had described. Finally, he looked up with the focused intensity of someone who had identified a serious problem and was already thinking about solutions. "Frank," he said, "what your grandson is attempting is called financial elder abuse, and it is both illegal and more common than most people realize. He is using a combination of isolation, manipulation, and false claims about your competency to gain control of your assets. The fact that he contacted me directly, making claims about your mental state without your knowledge or consent, actually strengthens your position if this situation ends up in court." Harold explained that Marcus's strategy, while sophisticated, had several weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood the legal system. The most important was that Marcus had been operating under the assumption that I was isolated and defenseless, that I had no one to advocate for my interests or challenge his narrative about my incompetency. "But you do have advocates," Harold continued. "You have me, you have Mrs. Rodriguez at the bank who knows you well, and you have a documented history of competent financial management that contradicts everything your grandson is claiming. More importantly, you have been aware of his manipulation and have been making rational decisions in response to it, which is the opposite of what someone experiencing cognitive decline would do." The conversation with Harold restored something I had not realized I was losing: confidence in my own judgment and my ability to fight back against Marcus's campaign. For weeks, I had been reacting to Marcus's moves, trying to defend against his manipulation while he maintained the initiative. But Harold was offering me something different, a way to take control of the situation and turn Marcus's own tactics against him. We spent the next hour developing a strategy that would expose Marcus's manipulation while protecting my interests. Harold would document everything I had told him, creating a legal record of Marcus's unauthorized contact with my attorney and his false claims about my mental state. Mrs. Rodriguez would provide a statement about my competency and my history as a reliable customer. Most importantly, Harold would help me regain control of my blocked accounts while building a case that could result in serious legal consequences for Marcus. But the most crucial element of our strategy involved something Harold could not help me with directly, proving that I had resources and capabilities that Marcus did not know about. This was where my gold reserves would play a decisive role, not just as a source of financial independence, but as proof that I had been planning and preparing for exactly this kind of situation for years. Harold left with a clear mission and a timeline for action. Within 48 hours, he would contact the bank, file the necessary papers to challenge the blocked accounts, and begin building a legal case against Marcus. But he also gave me something equally valuable, validation that my perceptions were accurate, that Marcus's behavior was not normal family concern but criminal manipulation, and that I had every right to fight back against it. That afternoon, I walked to my neighborhood coin shop, a small business I had been patronizing for 15 years. The owner, Tom Morrison, had helped me acquire most of my gold reserves over the years, and he understood both the value of precious metals and the importance of discretion in such transactions. Tom had always respected my privacy and had never asked questions about why an elderly man was steadily accumulating gold coins and bars. I selected 2 of my 1-ounce gold bars and made the familiar walk to Tom's shop. The transaction took less than 10 minutes, but it represented something profound. I was converting my hidden wealth into immediate cash without involving any banks, any financial institutions, or any systems that Marcus could monitor or control. When I walked out of that shop with $6,400 in cash, I was no longer the helpless elderly man that Marcus believed he had trapped. I wonder how many of you listening have ever had to find the strength to stand up for yourselves when the odds seemed impossible, when people you trusted had turned against you, when the systems you relied on had been compromised by those who claimed to be helping you. There is something powerful about realizing that you are not as defenseless as your enemies believe, that you have resources and capabilities they have not accounted for in their plans. That evening, when Marcus returned from his errands, I was sitting in my living room reading the newspaper as if nothing had changed. He asked how my day had been, expressing the same false concern that had characterized our interactions for weeks. I told him it had been quiet, that I had spent most of the day resting and thinking about our situation. But everything had changed. I was no longer the isolated, helpless victim that Marcus's plan required me to be. I had allies, I had resources, and I had a strategy for fighting back. Most importantly, I had remembered something that Marcus's manipulation had temporarily made me forget. I was not just a victim of his scheme, I was a man with almost 8 decades of experience in solving problems, overcoming obstacles, and protecting what mattered to me. Marcus had been counting on my isolation and my dependence on conventional financial systems to make his control inevitable. He had not accounted for the possibility that his elderly grandfather might have been preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal for most of his adult life. With cash in my pocket and a clear legal strategy in place, I began the careful work of building my counterattack against Marcus's scheme. The next few days required the kind of patience and attention to detail that I had learned during 40 years in business, but now I was applying those skills to protect my own life and dignity rather than managing someone else's project. Harold moved quickly on the legal front. By Monday morning, he had filed papers challenging the blocked accounts and demanding an immediate hearing on what he termed unauthorized financial interference with a competent adult. More importantly, he had contacted Mrs. Rodriguez and several other professionals who could testify to my mental competency and my history of responsible financial management. Harold was building a paper trail that would make it very difficult for Marcus to claim that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own investigation into Marcus's activities. Using my newfound cash resources, I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Sarah Chen who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. Sarah was professional, discreet, and experienced in exactly the kind of systematic manipulation that Marcus had been using against me. Within 2 days, she had uncovered information that both shocked and vindicated me. Marcus had been in serious financial trouble for months. His business school loans were in default, his credit cards were maxed out, and he had been living on borrowed money while maintaining the appearance of success. More disturbing, Sarah discovered that this was not Marcus's first attempt at financial manipulation. He had tried similar tactics with his maternal grandmother 2 years earlier, though that effort had been unsuccessful because she had other family members monitoring her affairs. Sarah also uncovered the network of people Marcus had been working with. The phone conversation I had overheard was with a lawyer who specialized in what he called asset protection for families dealing with elderly relatives. This lawyer had a questionable reputation and had been disciplined by the state bar for aggressive tactics in guardianship cases. Marcus was not working alone, he was part of a systematic operation that targeted elderly people with significant assets but limited family support. The most damaging evidence Sarah uncovered was a series of emails between Marcus and his confederates, discussing timelines, strategies, and the projected value of what they called the Thompson estate. They had been planning this operation for over 6 months, carefully researching my financial situation, my family relationships, and my daily routines. What Marcus had presented as spontaneous concern for my welfare was actually a calculated campaign that had been months in the making. Armed with this information, Harold and I refined our strategy. We would not simply defend against Marcus's accusations of incompetency, we would go on the offensive, exposing his manipulation and demanding legal consequences for his actions. Harold drafted a comprehensive complaint that detailed Marcus's unauthorized access to my financial information, his false representations to my bank and attorney, and his systematic isolation and control tactics. But the most important element of our strategy involved timing. Marcus was clearly preparing to escalate his campaign, probably planning to file for emergency guardianship within the next week or 2. We needed to strike first, to expose his manipulation before he could present his carefully constructed narrative to a judge who might not have time to investigate the true circumstances. The turning point came when Marcus made a crucial mistake. On Wednesday evening, he presented me with a new set of documents, claiming they were temporary arrangements that would help resolve the banking problems he had created. These papers would give him immediate access to my accounts, allow him to make medical decisions on my behalf, and authorize him to sell my property if he deemed it necessary for my care. The demands were so extreme that they revealed the true scope of Marcus's intentions. He was not just trying to gain control of my money, he was attempting to assume complete authority over every aspect of my life. The documents were presented as temporary measures, but they contained no expiration dates and no mechanisms for me to regain control once I had signed them. I told Marcus I needed time to review the papers with Harold, which prompted the most honest reaction I had seen from him in months. His carefully maintained facade of patience and concern cracked, replaced by barely controlled frustration and anger. He argued that involving lawyers would only complicate matters, that we should be able to resolve these issues within the family, that outside interference would make everything more difficult and expensive. For the first time, Marcus was showing his true feelings about my independence and my right to seek professional advice about decisions affecting my life. He wanted complete control with no outside oversight, no professional validation of his claims, and no opportunity for me to understand the full implications of what I was being asked to sign. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, I made several phone calls that would set our counterattack in motion. Harold would file our complaint first thing Thursday morning, requesting an emergency hearing and demanding the immediate restoration of my access to my own accounts. Sarah would deliver her investigative report to the police, providing evidence of Marcus's fraudulent activities and his pattern of targeting elderly relatives. Most importantly, I would implement the final phase of my own preparation. Over the next 24 hours, I would convert enough of my gold reserves to establish complete financial independence from any systems Marcus might have compromised. I would open new accounts at a different bank, establish new credit arrangements, and create a financial foundation that existed entirely outside Marcus's knowledge or influence. Those of you listening who have ever faced what seemed like impossible odds know the feeling I had that night as I prepared for the confrontation that would determine the rest of my life. There is a clarity that comes with having a plan, with knowing that you have resources your enemies do not suspect, with understanding that their apparent advantages are built on incomplete information about your true capabilities. Marcus had spent months positioning himself as the responsible party protecting an incompetent elderly man from his own poor judgment. Tomorrow, he would discover that his elderly grandfather had been planning for exactly this kind of betrayal longer than Marcus had been alive. He would learn that the man he had dismissed as confused and helpless had actually been 3 steps ahead of him throughout his entire campaign. The gold bars in my basement represented more than financial security, they represented the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand that the people closest to you could sometimes pose the greatest threats to your independence and dignity. Marcus was about to discover that underestimating someone because of their age was a mistake that would cost him far more than he had ever hoped to gain. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a day when everything would change. I woke before dawn, as had been my habit for decades, but this time the early hour served a strategic purpose. While Marcus slept in what he had come to consider his room, I was implementing the first phase of an operation he could never have anticipated. By 6:30, I had already visited Tom's coin shop for the second time that week, converting for more gold bars into cash. Tom asked no questions, as always, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes as I conducted what was clearly a significant liquidation. By 7:15, I was at First National Bank across town, an institution where I had never done business but where Marcus had no connections or influence. Opening new accounts with cash deposits raised some eyebrows, but my identification was solid, my explanations were reasonable, and the bank was happy to accommodate a new customer with substantial liquid assets. Within an hour, I had established checking and savings accounts, arranged for new debit and credit cards to be expedited, and set up online banking access that would give me complete financial independence from any systems Marcus had compromised. Harold's legal assault began at 9 sharp when he filed our complaint with the county court. The document was a masterpiece of legal precision, detailing Marcus's unauthorized activities, his false representations to my bank and attorney, and his systematic campaign to isolate and control me. Harold had also requested an emergency hearing, arguing that Marcus posed an immediate threat to my financial security and personal autonomy. The timing was crucial. Marcus had planned to file his own guardianship petition by the end of the week, presenting his carefully constructed narrative about my incompetency to a judge who would have no reason to question his claims. But now he would be responding to our allegations rather than making his own, defending his actions rather than attacking my competency. The first sign that our strategy was working came at 10:30 when Marcus received a phone call that clearly caught him off guard. I was in the kitchen when his phone rang, and I could hear his side of the conversation through the thin walls of my old house. Someone was telling him about Harold's filing, and Marcus's response revealed both his surprise and his anger at this unexpected development. "What do you mean he filed a complaint?" Marcus said, his voice losing all pretense of the calm concern he had been projecting for weeks. "He is supposed to be confused and dependent. How could he have organized something like this without help?" The conversation continued for several minutes, with Marcus receiving what was clearly unwelcome advice about the seriousness of the charges Harold had filed. I heard him mention lawyers, legal fees, and the possibility that his entire strategy had been compromised. For the first time since this ordeal began, Marcus sounded worried rather than confident. When Marcus emerged from his room an hour later, his demeanor had changed completely. The patient, caring grandson had been replaced by someone who was clearly under pressure and running out of time. He asked direct questions about my activities over the past few days, wanted to know if I had been talking to Harold, demanded to know where I had gotten money to pay for legal representation. I told him truthfully that I had been consulting with my attorney about the banking problems he had created, and that I intended to resolve those problems through proper legal channels. Marcus's reaction was immediate and revealing. He abandoned any pretense of having my best interests at heart and began arguing that involving lawyers would only make everything more complicated and expensive. But Marcus made his fatal error when he tried to pressure me into signing his documents immediately, before any legal proceedings could interfere with what he called our family arrangements. He spread the papers on my kitchen table with aggressive impatience, insisting that we could resolve everything quickly if I would just sign the authorizations he had prepared. I had been expecting this moment, and I was ready for it. Instead of refusing to sign or asking for more time to consider the documents, I told Marcus that I would be happy to sign them as soon as he could answer a few simple questions about my financial situation. If he truly understood my assets well enough to manage them responsibly, he should be able to provide basic information about my holdings. Marcus eagerly agreed, confident that his months of research had given him complete knowledge of my financial position. He rattled off figures for my checking and savings accounts, described my investment portfolio in detail, and even knew the approximate value of my house and car. His accuracy was impressive and disturbing, confirming that he had indeed conducted a thorough investigation of every aspect of my official financial life. But then I asked him about my gold holdings. Marcus looked confused, claiming he had never seen any documentation of precious metals investments. I asked about my safety deposit boxes at other banks, about my cash reserves, about the alternative assets I had been accumulating for decades. Marcus's confidence began to waver as he realized there were significant gaps in his knowledge of my financial situation. The turning point came when I asked Marcus to calculate the total value of my assets based on his research. He provided a figure that was substantial but represented less than 60% of my actual wealth. Marcus had been planning to steal what he thought was my entire financial foundation, but he had been working with incomplete information. The most valuable portion of my assets existed completely outside his knowledge or influence. I let Marcus absorb this information for several minutes before delivering the final blow. I told him that anyone who truly had my best interests at heart would have asked about all of my assets before proposing to manage them. Someone who was planning to steal from me, however, would have focused only on the assets that were easily discoverable through conventional research. Marcus's reaction confirmed everything I had suspected about his motives. Instead of asking how he could better serve my interests or expressing concern about assets he had not known about, he demanded immediate information about these hidden holdings. He wanted to know where the money was, how much there was, and how he could gain access to it. His mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the greedy, desperate young man who had been hiding behind months of false concern. That afternoon, while Marcus was frantically making phone calls to his confederates about this unexpected development, I received confirmation that our legal strategy was working perfectly. Harold called to report that the judge had agreed to an emergency hearing for the following Monday, and that Marcus's lawyer had already contacted the court asking for a postponement. Marcus was clearly not prepared to defend his actions under legal scrutiny. More importantly, Mrs. Rodriguez called to inform me that the blocks on my accounts had been removed pending the court hearing, and that the bank was conducting its own investigation into how those blocks had been implemented without proper authorization. Marcus's manipulation of my banking relationships was unraveling as quickly as it had been constructed. By evening, I had achieved something I had not experienced in months: complete financial independence and legal protection against Marcus's manipulation. I had access to my own money through multiple channels, legal representation that was aggressively defending my interests, and evidence that would expose Marcus's criminal behavior to anyone who cared to examine it. Friday brought the beginning of Marcus's desperate attempts to salvage his crumbling scheme. He had spent Thursday night on the phone with his lawyer and confederates, and by morning it was clear that they had advised him to accelerate his timeline dramatically. What had been planned as a gradual manipulation was now becoming a frantic race against legal proceedings that threatened to expose everything. Marcus's first move was to contact my doctor's office, claiming to be concerned about my mental state and requesting an emergency evaluation. He told them I had been exhibiting signs of confusion and paranoia, that I was making irrational decisions about my finances, and that I might be a danger to myself if left unsupervised. It was a clever tactic, designed to create medical documentation that could support his claims of incompetency. But Marcus had underestimated both my relationship with my longtime physician and my own proactive preparations. Dr. Patricia Williams had been my doctor for 12 years, and she knew me well enough to be skeptical of sudden claims about cognitive decline. More importantly, I had anticipated this exact strategy and had already scheduled my own appointment with Dr. Williams for a comprehensive evaluation. When Marcus's call came in Friday morning, Dr. Williams was already prepared with the results of extensive cognitive testing I had completed just 2 days earlier. The tests showed not only that I was mentally competent, but that my cognitive function was actually above average for my age group. Dr. Williams politely but firmly told Marcus that she could not discuss my medical condition with him without my written authorization, and that based on her recent examination, she had no concerns about my mental capacity. Marcus's second attempt involved returning to the bank with forged documentation claiming to give him emergency access to my accounts. He had apparently worked with his lawyer to create papers that looked official but had never been properly filed or authorized. Mrs. Rodriguez was not fooled by the forgeries, but she was alarmed by the audacity of Marcus's attempt to commit fraud in broad daylight at a financial institution. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately called Harold, who advised her to document everything and contact the police if Marcus attempted any further unauthorized activities. She also called me to report the incident, and her description of Marcus's behavior confirmed that he was becoming increasingly desperate as his options diminished. The most significant development came Friday afternoon when Sarah Chen completed her investigation and delivered her report to both Harold and the local police. Sarah had uncovered evidence that Marcus's operation was far more extensive than we had initially realized. He had been working with at least 3 other individuals to systematically target elderly people across the region, using similar manipulation tactics to gain control of their assets. Sarah's report included copies of emails, financial records, and recorded phone conversations that documented the entire conspiracy. Marcus was not just guilty of attempting to defraud me, he was part of an organized criminal enterprise that had successfully victimized at least 4 other elderly people over the past 2 years. The total amount stolen exceeded $500,000, making this a federal case that would involve FBI investigation. When Detective Robert Hayes contacted me Friday evening to discuss Sarah's findings, he explained that Marcus's attempt to manipulate me had actually uncovered a much larger criminal operation. The evidence Sarah had gathered would not only protect me from Marcus's scheme, but would likely result in the prosecution of an entire network of people who preyed on elderly citizens. Detective Hayes also confirmed what I had begun to suspect: Marcus's financial desperation was even worse than Sarah had initially discovered. He owed money to people who were not patient about collection, and he had been counting on quick access to my assets to resolve debts that were putting him in physical danger. This explained the acceleration of his timeline and his increasingly reckless behavior, as our legal defenses had blocked his access to what he considered his solution to serious personal problems. Saturday morning brought Marcus's most desperate gambit yet. He arrived at breakfast with official-looking papers claiming to be from the county health department, documents that allegedly required me to submit to immediate psychological evaluation due to reports of concerning behavior. The papers looked convincing enough that someone less suspicious might have been intimidated into compliance. But I had learned to examine everything Marcus presented with extreme skepticism, and these documents contained several obvious flaws that revealed their fraudulent nature. The letterhead was slightly wrong, the signatures looked forged, and the legal language contained errors that no government agency would have made. Marcus was now resorting to completely fabricated documents in his attempt to force me into the evaluation that would support his incompetency claims. When I pointed out the obvious forgeries and told Marcus I would be reporting this attempted fraud to the police, his composure finally cracked completely. The patient, caring grandson disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who was angry, desperate, and no longer concerned about maintaining his facade of concern for my welfare. Marcus demanded to know how an old man like me had managed to outmaneuver his carefully planned operation. He wanted to know who was helping me, how I had figured out his strategy, and where I had gotten the resources to fight back against his manipulation. His questions revealed both his frustration and his fundamental misunderstanding of the person he had been trying to victimize. I told Marcus that his mistake had been assuming that age automatically meant vulnerability, that living alone meant isolation, and that someone who preferred traditional banking methods was incapable of sophisticated planning. He had underestimated not just my resources and capabilities, but my willingness to fight for my independence and dignity when they were threatened. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had passed between us since this ordeal began. Marcus dropped all pretense of family concern and revealed the calculating predator who had been hiding behind months of manipulation. He talked about the money he needed, the people who were threatening him, and his conviction that elderly relatives owed it to younger family members to provide financial support when it was needed. Marcus's sense of entitlement was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that my assets should be available to solve his problems, that my independence was less important than his financial needs, and that his education and youth gave him the right to make decisions about my life. He had never seen me as a person with rights and preferences that deserved respect. I had always been nothing more than a resource to be exploited when he needed money. But Marcus's most revealing statement came when he accused me of being selfish for protecting my own assets instead of helping family members who were in trouble. He could not understand why someone my age needed financial independence, why I would want to maintain control over resources that would eventually be inherited by younger generations anyway. That evening, as I prepared for the court hearing that would determine the outcome of this entire conflict, I reflected on how completely Marcus had misunderstood both the situation and the person he had tried to victimize. He had seen an elderly man living alone and assumed he had found an easy target for manipulation and theft. He had never considered the possibility that his intended victim might be better prepared for this kind of conflict than he was. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. The emergency court hearing that would resolve this entire conflict was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and I had spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be the final confrontation with Marcus and his criminal conspiracy. Harold had assembled a comprehensive case that would not only protect my interests but expose the full scope of the fraud that had been attempted against me. Marcus had spent the weekend in increasingly frantic phone calls with his lawyer and confederates, and by Sunday evening it was clear that they were advising him to flee rather than face the legal consequences of their failed scheme. But Marcus was too desperate and too deep in debt to simply walk away from what he still saw as his solution to serious financial problems. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, but it contained everyone who mattered for this final resolution. Harold sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, radiating the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. Across the aisle, Marcus sat with his lawyer, a nervous-looking man who clearly wished he had never taken this case. Detective Hayes was present as an observer, ready to arrest Marcus immediately after the hearing if the judge found evidence of criminal activity. Judge Margaret Foster was exactly the kind of person I had hoped would hear this case, experienced, nonsense, and clearly intolerant of anyone who would attempt to defraud elderly citizens. She had reviewed Harold's filing over the weekend and had obviously done her own research into the patterns of elder abuse that Marcus's operation represented. Harold's presentation was methodical and devastating. He started with the timeline of Marcus's manipulation, documenting each step from the initial requests for financial control through the illegal blocking of my accounts. He presented evidence of Marcus's unauthorized contact with my bank, his false claims to my attorney and doctor, and his systematic gathering of information about my assets without my knowledge or consent. But the most damaging evidence came from Sarah Chen's investigation. Harold presented emails between Marcus and his confederates that revealed the calculated nature of their scheme, the research they had conducted into my daily routines and financial vulnerabilities, and their plans for liquidating my assets once they gained control. The communication showed that this was not family concern gone wrong, but a professional criminal operation that had been targeting elderly people for years. Judge Foster listened to the evidence with growing anger, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed her understanding of elder abuse tactics. When Harold presented the forged documents that Marcus had attempted to use at the bank and the fake government papers he had shown me, her expression made it clear that she viewed these as serious criminal acts rather than simple family disputes. Marcus's lawyer attempted a defense based on genuine concern for an elderly relative, but his arguments collapsed under the weight of evidence showing premeditation and coordination with known criminals. When Judge Foster asked Marcus directly why he had contacted multiple institutions making false claims about my mental capacity, his answer revealed the same sense of entitlement that had driven his entire scheme. Marcus told the judge that elderly people often do not recognize when they need help, that family members sometimes have to take action to protect relatives who are too proud or confused to accept assistance. He claimed that everything he had done was motivated by concern for my welfare and my inability to navigate modern financial systems safely. Judge Foster's response was swift and decisive. She pointed out that Marcus had never sought proper legal channels for expressing concerns about my competency, had never requested professional evaluations through appropriate medical or legal procedures, and had instead chosen to manipulate and deceive both me and the institutions that served me. His actions were not those of a concerned family member but of someone attempting to commit fraud. The moment I had been waiting for came when Judge Foster asked me to address the court directly about my competency and my ability to manage my own affairs. This was my opportunity to demonstrate that Marcus's claims about my mental decline were completely false, and to reveal the extent to which I had been aware of and prepared for his manipulation. I stood and spoke clearly about my understanding of Marcus's scheme, my strategic response to his manipulation, and my proactive steps to protect my assets and my independence. I described the legal representation I had arranged, the private investigation I had commissioned, and the financial preparations I had made to ensure that blocking my conventional accounts would not leave me helpless. Then came the moment that would shatter Marcus's assumptions about my vulnerability forever. Judge Foster asked about my financial resources and my ability to continue living independently despite Marcus's attempts to control my assets. I explained that while Marcus had researched my conventional investments and bank accounts, he had no knowledge of the alternative assets I had been accumulating for decades as protection against exactly this kind of situation. I told the court about my gold reserves, about the cash accounts I had established at other banks, and about the network of professional relationships I had maintained specifically to ensure my independence in case conventional systems were compromised. I explained that Marcus's manipulation had been based on incomplete information about my true financial position, and that his attempts to trap me through blocked accounts had failed because I had resources he did not know existed. The impact of this revelation on Marcus was immediate and devastating. For the first time, he fully understood that his months of careful planning had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the person he was trying to victimize. I was not the helpless, confused elderly man his scheme required me to be. I was someone who had been preparing for threats to my independence longer than he had been alive. Judge Foster asked Harold to present documentation of my alternative financial arrangements, and the evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements from my new accounts, receipts from gold transactions, and professional references from people who had worked with me for years all confirmed that I was not only financially independent but more sophisticated in my planning than Marcus had ever suspected. Whether it is morning where you are listening to this or late at night, I hope you can understand the satisfaction of that moment when someone who has underestimated you realizes the full extent of their mistake. Marcus had spent months believing he was manipulating a vulnerable old man, only to discover that his intended victim had been 3 steps ahead of him throughout the entire process. Judge Foster's final ruling was comprehensive and decisive. She not only restored my complete control over all my assets and accounts, but issued a restraining order preventing Marcus from any further contact with me or interference in my affairs. She also ordered restitution for the legal costs I had incurred defending against his manipulation and referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. But the most satisfying moment came when Detective Hayes stepped forward to arrest Marcus on charges of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marcus looked at me with an expression of shock and disbelief that made it clear he still did not fully understand how completely his scheme had failed. The elderly grandfather he had dismissed as confused and helpless had not only defeated his sophisticated criminal operation but had done so while maintaining his dignity, his independence, and his control over every aspect of his own life. Marcus had underestimated the wrong person, and he would spend years in prison paying for that mistake. The weeks following Marcus's arrest brought a sense of relief that I had not experienced in months, but also a profound sadness about what this betrayal meant for my family relationships. Detective Hayes kept me informed about the investigation as it expanded beyond Marcus to include his entire criminal network. The evidence Sarah Chen had gathered led to the arrest of 5 other individuals, including the lawyer who had been coaching Marcus on elder abuse tactics. The scope of their operation was staggering. Over 3 years, they had successfully defrauded 11 elderly victims out of more than $800,000. Most of their targets had been isolated seniors with substantial assets but limited family support, exactly the profile that Marcus had believed I fit. The difference was that I had been prepared for exactly this kind of attack, while their other victims had been caught completely off guard. Harold helped me understand the legal processes that would unfold over the coming months. Marcus would face federal charges for his role in the conspiracy, along with state charges for the specific crimes he had committed against me. The lawyer who had advised him would lose his license and face his own criminal prosecution. The private investigator who had helped them research their targets was already cooperating with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the most satisfying development came when Detective Hayes informed me that my case had become the key to unraveling the entire network. The evidence we had gathered, particularly the recorded conversations and documented financial manipulation, provided prosecutors with everything they needed to secure convictions against all the participants. Other victims who had been too intimidated or confused to seek justice were now finding their voices, knowing that their abusers would finally face consequences. The impact on my daily life was immediate and profound. For the first time in months, I could move freely through my own house without feeling like I was being watched and judged. I could make financial decisions without having to justify them to someone who was pretending to have my best interests at heart. I could answer my phone without wondering what new manipulation tactic was being deployed against me. Mrs. Rodriguez called to apologize for the bank's role in allowing Marcus to block my accounts, even temporarily. She assured me that new procedures had been implemented to prevent similar manipulation in the future, and that my long-standing relationship with the bank would be honored and protected. The branch had actually used my case as a training example for recognizing and preventing elder abuse, turning my experience into protection for other seniors. Dr. Williams also reached out to discuss the psychological impact of family betrayal and financial manipulation. She explained that what I had experienced was a form of trauma that many elderly people face but few are prepared to recognize or resist. She was impressed by my proactive response and my ability to maintain my mental and emotional equilibrium throughout the ordeal. But perhaps the most meaningful contact came from Tom Morrison at the coin shop. Tom had been discreetly curious about my recent gold transactions, and when news of Marcus's arrest made the local papers, he put the pieces together. Tom told me that my story had reminded him why he had gotten into the precious metals business in the first place, to help people protect their wealth and independence from exactly the kinds of threats I had faced. The legal resolution continued to unfold over several months. Marcus eventually pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges and multiple state felonies, receiving a sentence of 8 years in federal prison. His lawyer was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years. The other members of their network received sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with authorities. The financial restitution was substantial but secondary to the vindication of having my competency and judgment validated by the legal system. The court ordered Marcus to pay not only my legal costs but also punitive damages that reflected the psychological harm of his betrayal. While I would never recover the sense of family trust that his manipulation had destroyed, I had recovered something equally important: confidence in my ability to protect myself and my independence. The most unexpected development came when other elderly people in the community began reaching out to me for advice about protecting themselves from similar manipulation. Word had spread about how I had defeated a sophisticated elder abuse scheme, and people wanted to understand how they could prepare for threats they had never considered. Harold suggested that I consider speaking at community centers and senior organizations about financial security and family manipulation. I discovered that sharing my experience was both healing and empowering. Many elderly people lived with vague fears about becoming vulnerable to family members or criminals who might target them because of their age. By explaining how I had prepared for and defeated such an attack, I could offer practical strategies for maintaining independence and dignity in the face of potential threats. The speaking engagements also connected me with other seniors who had faced similar challenges. I met people who had been successfully manipulated by family members, others who had recognized manipulation attempts early enough to prevent them, and many who were worried about protecting themselves from threats they could see coming. These connections reminded me that family betrayal, while devastating, was unfortunately common enough that systems and strategies for dealing with it were essential. One of the most rewarding aspects of my new advocacy work was helping other elderly people understand that age did not automatically make them vulnerable, that experience and wisdom could be powerful tools for recognizing and defeating manipulation, and that proper preparation could provide protection against even sophisticated criminal schemes. I hope those of you listening who may be facing similar situations with family members or others who seem to be taking too much interest in your affairs will remember that you have more power and more options than manipulators want you to believe. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, seek professional help when you need it, and never let anyone convince you that your age disqualifies you from making decisions about your own life. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I was living a life that was both familiar and transformed. My daily routines had returned to the peaceful predictability I had enjoyed before Marcus's manipulation began, but I now had a deeper appreciation for the independence and security I had worked so hard to build and protect. I also had a new sense of purpose in helping other seniors understand that they could be both wise and vigilant, that they could protect themselves without becoming paranoid or isolated. The gold bars in my basement remained exactly where they had always been, but they now represented something beyond financial security. They were proof that patient preparation and conservative planning could provide protection against threats that seemed impossible to anticipate, validation that the old ways of building and preserving wealth still had value in a modern world that often dismissed traditional approaches as outdated. A year later, I sit in the same kitchen where this entire ordeal began, drinking coffee and reading the morning newspaper just as I had on that Tuesday when Marcus first arrived with his papers and his false concern. The routine is familiar, but everything else has changed in ways that have made my life richer and more purposeful than I could have imagined when I was simply an elderly man living quietly in retirement. The spare bedroom that Marcus had occupied for those terrible weeks is now my office, where I prepare materials for the presentations I give at senior centers and community organizations across the region. The desk where he once sorted through my private papers now holds correspondence from elderly people who have reached out for advice about protecting themselves from financial manipulation. What was once a space contaminated by betrayal has become a center for education and empowerment. Harold remains not just my attorney but a valued collaborator in the advocacy work that has become my unexpected second career. Together, we have developed workshops that teach seniors about the warning signs of family financial abuse, the legal protections available to them, and the practical steps they can take to maintain their independence while preparing for potential threats. The demand for these presentations has grown beyond anything we anticipated. Mrs. Rodriguez has become an ally in this work as well. The bank now sponsors some of our community education programs, and Mrs. Rodriguez often speaks about the institutional safeguards that financial institutions can provide when elderly customers feel pressured or manipulated. My case has become a model for how banks can better protect their older customers without patronizing them or assuming they are incapable of managing their own affairs. Sarah Chen has also remained involved, helping other seniors understand how to investigate concerns about family members who seem to be taking unusual interest in their finances. Her expertise in uncovering manipulation tactics has proven invaluable in cases where subtle coercion is difficult to recognize or document. Several other criminal schemes have been exposed through the techniques she developed while investigating Marcus's operation. The gold that saved my independence remains in my basement, but it now represents something beyond personal security. During my presentations, I often talk about the importance of diversifying not just investment portfolios but also the very foundations of financial independence. Too many seniors become vulnerable because they rely entirely on conventional banking systems that can be manipulated by people who gain their trust. The lessons I share go beyond precious metals to include the broader principle of maintaining multiple layers of security and independence. I encourage people to maintain relationships with professionals who knew them before any family manipulation began, to keep some resources outside conventional systems that could be compromised, and to trust their instincts when family members suddenly become overly concerned with their financial affairs. But perhaps the most important message I share is about dignity and self-worth. Marcus's manipulation was effective not just because of his tactical sophistication, but because he systematically undermined my confidence in my own judgment and capabilities. He used my age as a weapon against me, suggesting that the natural process of growing older had automatically made me vulnerable and incompetent. The truth I have learned through this experience is that age brings wisdom, caution, and perspective that can be powerful tools for recognizing and defeating manipulation. The elderly people who attend my presentations are not helpless victims waiting to be exploited. They are experienced individuals who have spent decades solving problems, overcoming obstacles, and protecting what matters to them. They simply need to be reminded of their own strength and given practical tools for applying that strength to modern threats. The community that has formed around this work has become one of the most rewarding aspects of my later years. I have met remarkable people who have faced and overcome their own challenges with family manipulation, financial abuse, and threats to their independence. Their stories have taught me that resilience and determination do not diminish with age, and that the desire to maintain dignity and autonomy remains strong throughout life. Some of the people I have worked with have faced situations even more challenging than mine. I have met seniors who were physically isolated by manipulative family members, others who were medicated into compliance, and many who lost substantial assets before recognizing what was happening to them. But I have also met people who successfully identified manipulation early, who built effective defenses against family pressure, and who maintained their independence despite sophisticated attempts to undermine it. Dr. Williams has been particularly helpful in understanding the psychological aspects of family betrayal and recovery from financial manipulation. She has explained that the trauma of being targeted by someone you trust can be more devastating than the financial losses involved, but that successful resistance to such manipulation can actually strengthen confidence and self-efficacy in ways that benefit overall mental health. The legal aftermath of Marcus's case continued to unfold throughout the year. The federal investigation expanded to include similar operations in other states, ultimately leading to more than 30 arrests and the recovery of over $2 million in stolen assets. Marcus himself remains in federal prison, where he will spend the next 7 years reflecting on the consequences of underestimating someone because of their age. I have received letters from other victims of the conspiracy, thanking me for the evidence that made their own cases possible. Many of them had felt isolated and ashamed about being manipulated by family members, and knowing that their experiences were part of a larger criminal pattern helped them understand that they were not naive or foolish, but targets of sophisticated predators who specialized in exploiting family relationships. As I finish my coffee and prepare for another day that will include a presentation at the downtown senior center, I reflect on how completely my life has been transformed by what initially seemed like a devastating betrayal. Marcus intended to steal my money and my independence, to reduce me to a helpless dependent who existed at his mercy. Instead, his attack revealed strengths I did not know I still possessed and connected me with a community of people who share my determination to age with dignity and autonomy. For those of you listening who may be concerned about your own vulnerability to family manipulation or financial abuse, remember that your age represents wisdom and experience, not automatic weakness. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, maintain relationships with professionals who knew you before any problems began, and never let anyone convince you that growing older has disqualified you from making decisions about your own life. The gold in my basement continues to provide security, but the real treasure I discovered through this ordeal was the understanding that preparation, wisdom, and determination are more valuable than any amount of precious metal. Marcus thought he was stealing from a helpless old man, but he was actually taking on someone who had been preparing for exactly his kind of challenge for most of his adult life. I am still the same person who values routine, independence, and careful planning. But I am also now someone who understands that these qualities, combined with proper preparation and professional support, can provide protection against even the most sophisticated threats to dignity and autonomy. That knowledge has made my final years not just secure, but meaningful in ways I never expected when I was simply enjoying a quiet retirement.